The cold wind howled through the barren landscape, whipping sand and ice across the alien desert. In this desolate place, where nothing could survive except the most hardened of creatures, there lay a figure, broken, battered, and abandoned. She was unlike anything a human could imagine. Tall, with skin like polished metal that glinted under the harsh light of two suns. Her glowing eyes were closed, her body bruised and bleeding, her once proud wings now torn and useless at her sides. She was the queen of a mighty alien race, but right now, she was nothing more than a wounded stranger, left to die alone. Her name was Velana, and she had once been powerful, the leader of her people. Her strength and wisdom had kept her kingdom safe for generations, but everything had changed in a heartbeat. The betrayal had come from the most unexpected place. Her closest allies, the ones she trusted most, turned on her in a brutal act of violence. They had orchestrated her downfall, leaving her for dead on this cold, unforgiving desert planet. Velana remembered the pain, the explosion that had torn through her ship, the sharp blow to her side that knocked her unconscious. When she awoke, she found herself lying on the frozen ground of an alien world, far from home and in the grip of death itself. Her attackers had made sure she would never escape. They didn't care if she lived or died. They simply left her to face the endless cold of the desert alone. The cold was unbearable. Velana could feel the icy winds cutting through her body like 1,000 knives. She was dying, and she knew it. The air was thin and harsh, making every breath feel like a struggle. Her strength was fading, her vision blurring. She tried to lift her head, but her neck was stiff, and every movement caused sharp pain to shoot through her. She wanted to scream, but no sound came from her lips. The sand shifted around her, the desolation mocking her helplessness. Despite the agony, she clung to life. Her thoughts were scattered, a fog of confusion clouding her mind. She tried to remember how she had ended up here. She was supposed to be with her people, leading them to peace and prosperity. Instead, she had been betrayed by the very one she had trusted. Her body, once a symbol of power and grace, now felt fragile and weak. She was not the queen anymore, just a broken woman at the mercy of a harsh, unforgiving world. As the night fell, the temperature dropped even further, and Velana could feel her body growing colder. She fought against the darkness creeping into her mind, struggling to stay awake, but it was becoming impossible. The cold was seeping into her bones, numbing her senses, and the weight of her injuries dragged her into unconsciousness. Suddenly, a sharp noise pierced the silence. The sound of something moving across the desert, a faint echo in the vast emptiness. Velana's eyes fluttered open, but the world around her was a blur. She could make out a dark shape in the distance, moving toward her. She blinked, her vision clearing slightly, and she saw that it was a figure, a human, strange and out of place in this alien desert. Her heart beat faster, but her body could barely respond. The figure drew closer, and Velana could see that he was wearing weathered, torn clothing, a scarf wrapped tightly around his face to protect against the cold. He was moving slowly, carefully, as though searching for something or someone. At first, she wondered if he was a mirage, a trick of her dying mind. But then, the human stopped and knelt beside her. Velana tried to speak, but her voice was nothing more than a rasp, barely audible over the wind. She wanted to ask him who he was, why he was here, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat was too dry, her lips cracked and swollen. Instead, she could only look at him with what little strength she had left. The human seemed to sense her pain. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small bottle of water, unscrewing the cap and carefully bringing it to her lips. She drank greedily, but it was just a small amount, not enough to ease the dryness in her throat. Her hand trembled as she tried to grab hold of the bottle, but her fingers were stiff and weak. "You're lucky I found you," the human said softly, his voice muffled by his scarf. "You shouldn't be out here alone." Velana wanted to respond, but the words felt too heavy, like they would fall apart before they reached her lips. She tried to look up at him, but her head felt too heavy. She felt so small in this vast, lonely world. She had ruled over millions, but here she was just a broken soul, desperate for help. For the first time in her life, she felt vulnerable, and the thought terrified her. The human carefully checked her injuries, pulling away pieces of her torn clothing to examine the deep gashes in her side. He seemed knowledgeable, as if he had seen pain like this before. Despite the strange look of the desert planet and the alien nature of the Queen, he worked with a calmness that made her feel a little safer. His hands were steady, even when they shook from the cold, as he did his best to stop the bleeding. Vaylana tried to remember who he was, but her mind was foggy. She couldn't recall ever meeting a human before. Still, something about him seemed familiar, as though his presence brought a sense of comfort. She wondered how he had come to be on this desolate planet. Was he also a survivor, like her? "Stay with me," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're not alone." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that he could save her, but the pain in her body and the cold seeping deeper into her bones told her that time was running out. Still, she clung to life, not because she feared death, but because there was something inside her, something powerful, that refused to give up. As the human continued to care for her, Vaylana felt a small flicker of hope. She had been left to die, abandoned by everyone she had trusted. But now, perhaps she wasn't alone. The desert still stretched endlessly before them, but for the first time since her betrayal, she felt that maybe there was a chance for survival. Her journey was far from over, and the road ahead would be filled with danger and uncertainty. But for the first time, Vaylana had a reason to fight, to stay alive. There was someone who cared enough to save her, and that was all that mattered. Alex had always been a wanderer. He wasn't one to stay in one place for too long. The quiet, the isolation, and the endless horizon of the desert were all he knew. He had been stuck on this cold, barren world for years after a crash. His ship had gone down during a storm in space, and now he found himself stranded on this strange planet with no way to contact anyone. The world was harsh and unforgiving. The cold desert stretched endlessly in every direction, with winds that could freeze a person in minutes. Yet somehow, Alex had learned to survive. The desert planet was a place where few dared to visit. The thin atmosphere made breathing difficult, and the temperatures dropped far below freezing at night. During the day, the sun scorched everything in sight. Most travelers avoided the planet because of its hostility, but Alex had no choice. He had been stuck here for far too long, with no way of leaving. Every day, he searched for food and water, scavenging what he could from the wreckage of his ship and anything he could find in the desert. His clothes were worn and torn, and his face was weathered from the harsh winds. He had learned to adapt to the planet's brutality, but it hadn't been easy. It had taken him months just to find a steady supply of water, and even now, every day was a struggle. Alex didn't mind the isolation. He preferred it, actually. There was no one to bother him out here. No one to remind him of the life he had lost, the family he would never see again. The crash had taken everything from him: his job, his friends, his future. He had spent so much time trying to figure out a way off this planet, but nothing had worked. His ship was too damaged, and the technology on this world was too primitive to help him fix it. It wasn't just the lack of technology that made this place so unbearable. It was the silence. In the desert, there was nothing to hear except the wind and the occasional sound of a creature scurrying beneath the sand. It was a kind of silence that could drive a person mad if they let it. But Alex had long since learned to live with it. He had learned to accept that this was his life now. On this particular day, Alex was scavenging near the wreckage of his ship, searching for any materials that could help him survive another week. He was checking the remains of the ship's cargo hold when he heard something faint, a sound that broke the monotony of the desert silence. It was weak, like a faint whisper on the wind. He paused and listened carefully, his heart racing for a moment as he tried to make sense of it. At first, he thought it might have been the wind playing tricks on him. The desert was full of strange noises, and his mind often played games with him in the quiet. But this sound was different. It was almost like a voice. Not quite a whisper, but a soft, broken plea for help. Alex's instincts kicked in. He immediately dropped the piece of metal he was holding and rushed toward the sound. The desert was vast, and it was easy to lose track of where you were. But Alex had spent enough time here to know the terrain. He followed the sound, moving quickly, pushing his tired body forward. The wind bit at his skin, but he ignored it. His focus was on the sound that had caught his attention. It didn't take long for Alex to find the source. There, lying in the sand, barely alive, was the figure of a woman. At first, he thought she was dead. Her body was motionless, her skin pale, and her breathing shallow. But as he moved closer, he saw her eyes flutter open, glowing faintly under the desert sun. She was an alien. He had never seen anything like her before. She was tall and slender, with skin that shimmered like metal. Her wings, once majestic, Alex assumed, were now torn and broken, hanging limply at her sides. Her body was covered in bruises and cuts, and blood stained the sand around her. Her eyes met his, but they were unfocused, and for a moment, Alex wasn't sure if she could even see him. Alex's heart raced. He had never seen anything like her. The alien world he had crashed on was filled with strange creatures, but this was something different. She wasn't like the sand-dwelling creatures or the wild beasts that roamed the planet. She looked human in some strange, otherworldly way. For a moment, Alex hesitated. He didn't know who or what this being was. She could be a threat. Maybe she had been left here by someone else, someone who would come looking for her. But something about her, something in her eyes, told him she wasn't dangerous. She was just as stranded as he was. Without thinking, Alex knelt beside her. He had no medical training, but he had learned a few basic survival skills over the years. He quickly checked her pulse, and to his relief, it was weak but steady. She was alive, but just barely. Alex's mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do. He knew he couldn't just leave her here to die. Despite his loneliness and isolation, Alex wasn't a heartless person. He had always believed in helping others, even if it meant putting himself at risk. He remembered the first few weeks after the crash, when he had felt the weight of hopelessness pressing down on him. It was hard to keep going when there was no one else around. But then, he had realized something important. Survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about helping each other. He gently lifted her into his arms, doing his best to support her broken body. She was light, but she felt fragile, like a delicate piece of glass. Her skin was cold to the touch, and Alex realized she was dangerously close to freezing. He needed to get her out of the wind, somewhere safe and fast. With his heart pounding in his chest, Alex carried her back to the small shelter he had built for himself in the desert. It was a makeshift home made of scraps from his ship and whatever materials he had scavenged. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him alive. He had no idea who she was, where she had come from, or why she was here. But one thing was clear: he couldn't leave her behind. As he carefully laid her down on the floor of his shelter, Alex realized that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. He wasn't just saving a stranger. He was about to learn that the world he thought he knew, this desert wasteland, was hiding secrets that would change everything. He glanced down at the alien woman. Her breathing was still faint, but at least she wasn't dying anymore. Alex wasn't sure how he would get her back to full health, but he was determined to try. He owed her that much, and maybe, just maybe, in helping her, he would find a way to help himself. The winds howled outside, but in his small shelter, Alex knew that for the first time in years, he wasn't truly alone. Alex sat by the small fire, staring into the flickering flames as the desert wind howled outside his shelter. His hands trembled, not from the cold but from the weight of the situation. He had never imagined his life would take a turn like this. One minute, he was scavenging for food in the desert, trying to survive. And the next, he was caring for an injured alien who had fallen from the sky, or from somewhere far beyond. The woman, the alien, lay on the makeshift bed he had created for her. She looked even more fragile up close. Her skin, once shiny and metallic, had now dulled from the cold and the blood loss. He could see the deep gashes and bruises on her body, injuries that had come from something far more violent than anything Alex had ever encountered in the desert. She was alive, but barely. Her shallow breaths were the only sign that she was still holding on to life. Alex had been trying to keep her warm, wrapping her in blankets and trying to feed her small amounts of water, but it seemed like everything he did barely made a difference. He knew he wasn't equipped for this kind of rescue. He was a scavenger, not a healer. Yet, something in him refused to give up. He couldn't just leave her to die. She needed help, and for some reason, he couldn't walk away. The fire crackled, and Alex let out a deep sigh. It had been hours since he had found her, and in that time, the desert night had fully descended. The cold was relentless, seeping through the walls of his shelter, but he wasn't about to let the cold stop him from trying to save her. The woman needed him, and for the first time in years, Alex felt like he had a purpose. His thoughts were interrupted by a faint groan. Alex immediately turned his attention to her, his heart racing. She was stirring. Her eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened, revealing eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light of the shelter. They were a strange color, nothing like the eyes of any human he had ever seen. They shone with a kind of unnatural light, like stars trapped in the dark. Alex took a step forward, trying to hide the worry on his face. "You're awake," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you feel?" The woman's eyes struggled to focus, and she winced in pain. She tried to move, but her body seemed to protest, as if it wasn't strong enough to obey. Alex quickly rushed to her side, offering a hand to steady her. "Don't try to move too much," he cautioned. "You're hurt. You need to rest." She looked at him, confusion clouding her features. For a moment, she didn't seem to recognize him or even understand where she was. Her eyes darted around the small shelter, taking in the simple surroundings. When her gaze finally met his, there was a flicker of recognition. She opened her mouth, but only a weak rasp escaped her lips. "Who are you?" Her voice was faint, strained, like a whisper on the wind. Alex felt a pang of sympathy. He hadn't expected her to remember much, especially after the injury and the state she had been in when he found her. "My name's Alex," he replied. "I found you in the desert. You were almost dead when I found you. I had to bring you back here." She blinked, trying to process the information. Alex could see the effort it took for her to stay conscious. Her breathing was still shallow, and her body trembled with the effort of staying awake. She stopped, her voice fading as if the words were too heavy for her to speak. "I'm Velana." "Velana," Alex repeated. The name was unfamiliar to him, but there was something about the way she said it, something in her tone, that made him realize this wasn't just some random stranger he had stumbled upon. This woman was important. She was not like the usual people or creatures he encountered in the desert. "Who are you?" he asked gently, though he wasn't sure if she would be able to answer. Velana closed her eyes for a moment, as though trying to gather the strength to speak. When she opened them again, her gaze seemed clearer, more focused, though there was still a hint of confusion in her eyes. "I'm the queen of my people," she said slowly, as though the words themselves were a weight on her tongue. I was betrayed. My own people. They left me for dead. But you saved me." Alex's heart skipped a beat. A queen. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The woman lying in front of him, covered in bruises and blood, was royalty. It didn't make sense. She looked so fragile, so unlike the powerful figure he had imagined when he first heard the word queen. And yet, something about the way she spoke rang true. There was a quiet strength in her voice, even though her body seemed weak. "I didn't know who you were when I found you," Alex admitted. "I just knew I had to help. I didn't even know if you were human. But it doesn't matter now. I just want to make sure you're okay." Vaylana's eyes softened, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "You're kind," she whispered. "Not many would have helped someone like me." Alex shrugged, feeling awkward under her gaze. "I'm not a hero. I couldn't leave you there. The desert's a harsh place. I've been alone for too long to turn my back on someone who needs help." For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence hung heavy in the air, only interrupted by the crackling of the fire and the sound of the wind outside. Alex watched her closely, waiting for her to say something more, but she seemed to be drifting in and out of consciousness. "Rest now," Alex said softly. "I'll keep you safe here. You're not alone anymore." Vaylana closed her eyes and nodded weakly. "Thank you for saving me." Her voice was barely audible, but Alex could tell it was sincere. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something deeper. She had trusted him, even in her weakened state. As Alex sat beside her, keeping watch over her through the night, he realized that the rescue wasn't just about saving her life. In some strange way, rescuing Vaylana had given him a sense of purpose again, a sense of connection. For the first time since his crash, Alex felt like he wasn't completely alone in the universe. Outside, the desert winds raged on, but inside the shelter, Alex knew that the storm was far from over. Vaylana had been saved, but there were still many questions to answer. Why had she been left for dead on the desert? What kind of enemies did she have? And how could Alex, a simple wanderer, help someone as important as a queen? The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Whatever happened next, Alex would not be facing it alone. Days passed since Vaylana had been brought into Alex's shelter. The cold winds outside continued to blow through the barren desert, but inside, a small fire crackled warmly, offering a sense of comfort. The shelter, built from scraps of Alex's old ship and any materials he could salvage from the desert, had never felt more like a home than it did now. He was no longer alone, and the presence of the alien queen, Vaylana, had made all the difference. At first, Vaylana had been weak and disoriented. She could barely sit up, let alone walk. Her injuries were severe, and her body had been battered and drained by both the cold desert and the betrayal she had suffered. But with each passing day, Alex noticed small improvements. She could now sit up for short periods of time, and her breathing had become steadier. Her once dull skin had regained some of its natural glow, and her eyes, though still faintly glowing, were no longer clouded with confusion. Alex kept a close eye on her, making sure she had enough water and food, which was a struggle since resources were scarce in the desert. But he didn't mind. For the first time in a long while, he had a purpose. He wasn't just scavenging to survive anymore. He was helping someone else survive. Vaylana was grateful, though she had yet to speak much of her past. In the quiet moments when she wasn't sleeping, Alex would try to learn more about her, but she would quickly change the subject or retreat into herself. It was clear that her mind was still occupied with the pain and trauma of the betrayal she had endured. The scars on her body were visible reminders of the violence she had suffered, but Alex suspected there were deeper scars, ones that went beyond the physical wounds. One afternoon, as Alex was tending to the fire, Vaylana spoke for the first time in a while. Her voice, though still soft and weak, was filled with a determination Alex hadn't heard before. "Alex," she said, her tone hesitant, "I owe you more than I can say. You saved my life, but I am not sure how much longer I can stay here." Alex looked up from the fire, his eyes meeting hers. She was sitting against the wall, her legs crossed beneath her. Her eyes were focused on the flames, but Alex could see the uncertainty in her expression. "You don't have to worry about that," Alex replied, trying to sound reassuring. "You don't need to go anywhere until you're ready. You're still healing, and I'll help you. The desert is a dangerous place, and I'm not letting you leave until you're strong enough." Velana looked at him for a long moment, as if considering his words carefully. "I'm not afraid of the desert," she said quietly. "I faced far worse than this cold." Alex could sense the sadness in her voice, but he didn't push her. He knew she had been through something terrible, something that had scared her in ways that weren't easy to talk about. Instead, he nodded and said, "Maybe, but you don't have to face it alone anymore. You've got me." At those words, Velana's eyes softened. She was silent for a few moments, staring at the fire as if lost in thought. Then, finally, she spoke again, this time more slowly. "You remind me of someone," she said, almost to herself. "Who?" Alex asked, his curiosity piqued. "My brother," Velana replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was always like you, determined to help others, even when it was hard. He was kind-hearted, like you." Alex felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected her to speak about her past, let alone mention someone so close to her. He leaned against the wall beside her, trying to find the right words. "I'm sorry," he said gently, "about your brother." Velana nodded, her eyes clouded with sadness. "He died in the betrayal," she murmured. "He tried to protect me, but they killed him. They killed so many of my people. I couldn't save him. I couldn't save anyone." Alex didn't know what to say. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was clear that Velana had lost more than just her kingdom. She had lost those she cared about most. She had lost her family, her home, and her sense of purpose. The grief was written on her face, and it was something Alex could understand, even though he hadn't experienced the same loss. The loneliness of being stranded on this desert planet, the feeling of being forgotten, he had felt that too. But as the silence stretched between them, Alex realized something important. He had his own way of surviving, his own way of facing the darkness. He had been alone for a long time, but in the past few days, he had come to realize that he didn't have to be alone anymore. Velana might have been a stranger to him at first, but now she felt like something more, something important. They were both survivors of their own kind of battle, and in this moment, they were both trying to heal. "You don't have to carry this alone," Alex said softly. "Whatever you've lost, whatever you're feeling, I'm here for you. You're not alone anymore. We're in this together." Velana turned to look at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something Alex couldn't quite place. She said nothing at first, but the warmth in her gaze was enough to tell him that she was beginning to trust him. Slowly, she shifted her position, sitting a little closer to him. She hesitated for a moment, and then spoke again, her voice stronger now. "Thank you," she said, "for not abandoning me. I don't know if I can ever repay you for saving my life, but I want you to know that you have my gratitude." Alex smiled faintly. "I didn't do it for anything in return. I couldn't leave you to die out there." Velana nodded, her expression softening. "I can see that now. You're different from the others. Most would have left me, but you stayed." There was a long pause, a quiet understanding between them that neither could explain fully. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about the bond they had begun to form. They had both suffered in their own ways, and now they were finding strength in each other. As the days passed, their bond grew stronger. Velana became more mobile, able to walk around the shelter and help with small tasks, though she was still weak. She began to open up more, telling Alex stories of her kingdom, of her people, and of the betrayal that had left her stranded in the desert. In return, Alex shared his own story, how he had ended up stranded on this planet, how he had learned to survive by his wits and his stubbornness. They were both survivors, but now they were survivors together. They laughed at small jokes, shared meals, and even found moments of peace amidst the harsh desert life. The loneliness that had plagued them for so long began to fade, replaced by a growing friendship, a connection that neither of them had expected but both of them welcomed. One evening, as the sun set and the desert sky turned to a deep purple, Vailana sat next to Alex by the fire. The wind had died down, and for the first time in a long while, the air felt still and calm. They both sat in silence, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "I never thought I'd find peace again," Vailana said quietly, breaking the silence. "But now, here with you, I think I might." Alex smiled, looking out at the stars as well. "Maybe we both can find peace," he said softly, "together." And in that moment, as the desert winds whispered around them, they both understood that they weren't just surviving anymore. They were beginning to heal, to find hope, and to rebuild what had been broken. As the days passed in the shelter, life began to feel almost normal for Alex and Vailana. The cold winds outside had settled into a regular rhythm, and the fire inside crackled steadily, filling the small shelter with warmth. Vailana had healed considerably, her body growing stronger with each passing day. While she still wasn't fully recovered, she was now able to stand and walk with some assistance. The shadows of her past, betrayal, loss, and the destruction of her people still haunted her, but she was starting to open up more, sharing pieces of her story with Alex, piece by piece. Despite the growing bond between them, there was an underlying tension. The desert, though vast and empty, was not a place to stay forever. Alex had known from the beginning that Vailana could not remain here for long. The desert wasn't safe, and neither of them had the luxury of waiting for time to heal their wounds. Something was always chasing them, something they could never outrun. Vailana had told him little about her enemies, but the bits and pieces she had revealed were enough to make Alex understand that danger was never far away. Whoever had betrayed her and her people wasn't just going to let her go. The desert might offer temporary shelter, but sooner or later they would come looking for her. Alex couldn't deny it any longer. The time had come for them to leave. One morning, as the sun slowly began to rise, casting long shadows across the sand, Alex stood outside the shelter, his eyes scanning the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly before him, its vast emptiness both beautiful and terrifying. The wind had picked up again, the soft whispers of sand shifting beneath the gusts. Alex tightened his grip on the makeshift staff he had crafted from the wreckage of his ship. The sun was still low, but the heat of the day would soon follow. He knew it wouldn't be long before the desert would feel unbearable again. Behind him, Vailana stepped out of the shelter, her movements slower but determined. She had been quiet this morning, more serious than usual, as if she was preparing herself for something. Her once dull skin had regained much of its shine, and her eyes, though still holding sorrow, were more alert now, sharper. She had become a survivor, just like Alex. "You're thinking of leaving, aren't you?" she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of understanding. Alex turned to look at her, his expression serious. "We can't stay here much longer. You're getting stronger, but we both know that staying in one place for too long will only make us easier to find. They'll come for you, Vailana. We need to keep moving." Vailana didn't argue. She had known this moment was coming, even if she didn't want to admit it. She had spent her entire life running from her enemies, from betrayal, and from the pieces of herself she had lost. Now she was running again. But this time, it wasn't just about escaping. This time, she had someone to fight with. "I agree," she said, her tone steady. "But where do we go?" Alex paused, his gaze drifting over the desert landscape. The desert was unforgiving, and there was no obvious place to run to, but he had an idea. Over the past few days, he had noticed something in the distance, a faint trail of smoke on the horizon, a sign that there might be other survivors, or perhaps a settlement that had managed to survive in this harsh environment. He wasn't sure if it would be a friend or a foe, but it was a chance, and right now, that was all they had. "There's a settlement to the east," Alex said, pointing in the direction where he had seen the smoke. "It's not much, but it's the only lead we've got. We'll have to move quickly, but if we're lucky, we might find allies." Vaylana's eyes narrowed, a flicker of hope crossing her face. "Allies?" she asked, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. She had learned not to trust easily, not after the betrayal she had suffered. But she also knew that survival depended on alliances. Alone, neither she nor Alex stood much of a chance in the unforgiving desert. "Yeah," Alex replied, his voice firm. "We need help, and they might need ours too. If we can make it to that settlement, maybe we'll find a way to get you the protection you need." Vaylana nodded, her expression serious. "Then we leave now. No more wasting time." The decision was made. They gathered their things, what little they had, and set off into the desert. The journey wouldn't be easy. The heat of the day would soon become unbearable, and the winds could change at any moment. But they didn't have the luxury of waiting. As they moved, Alex kept a watchful eye on Vaylana. She was stronger now, but the strain of the desert still wore her down. The sand burned beneath their feet, and the sun beat relentlessly against their skin. Still, she didn't complain. She moved with determination, her head held high despite the exhaustion she must have been feeling. She was a queen, after all. Her pride and strength were undeniable, even in her weakened state. The landscape around them was harsh and barren. The occasional rock or twisted, dying tree was the only sign of life in this seemingly endless wasteland. But the sight of the distant smoke on the horizon gave them both a small spark of hope. It was faint, but it was there. It was enough to keep them going. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting an orange glow across the desert. Alex and Vaylana pressed on, taking short breaks when needed, drinking what little water they had left. The days in the desert were long, but they had learned to push through. Alex had learned to navigate by the stars, by the winds, and by the small signs of life around them. The desert, in its own way, was familiar to him now. But Vaylana, with her strength and resilience, was learning to adapt too. It wasn't until the afternoon that they finally reached the edge of the settlement. It wasn't much, just a cluster of small, makeshift buildings that had been constructed with whatever materials the survivors could find. It was a far cry from the civilization that Vaylana had once known, but it was still a place of refuge, a place where, perhaps, they could find safety. As they approached the settlement, Alex felt a sense of cautious optimism. This could be their chance, but as they drew closer, he could sense something was off. There were no guards at the entrance, no signs of life except for a faint movement in the windows of one of the buildings. Vaylana tensed beside him. "Something's not right," she whispered, her voice low. Alex nodded, his instincts telling him the same. They couldn't afford to be careless now. The enemies who had once betrayed Vaylana might still be out there, searching for her. They might have found this settlement already. But Alex wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not when they had come so far. "Stay close," he said, his voice firm. "We'll find out what's going on." Together, they moved cautiously toward the settlement, ready for whatever lay ahead. But in the back of Alex's mind, there was one thought that wouldn't leave him. The pursuit had begun, and there was no turning back now. The sun hung low in the sky as Alex and Vaylana approached the settlement, their footsteps soft in the sand. The eerie silence surrounding the small cluster of buildings only made their anxiety grow. There was something strange about the place. Normally, a settlement like this would be bustling with activity, people moving about, gathering supplies, or talking around a campfire. But here, there was only an unsettling stillness. Alex's instincts were on high alert. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled as he surveyed the surroundings. There were no signs of life outside, no guards, no animals, and only a few faint movements visible from the windows of the shacks. It didn't seem right. He had hoped for a place of refuge, but instead, he had a feeling they were walking into something dangerous. Vaylana, walking beside him, could sense it too. Her sharp eyes scanned the settlement, and her tense posture betrayed her concern. She had learned to trust her instincts, especially after everything she had been through. This place, this quiet settlement, felt wrong. She had been through too many betrayals to walk into another trap. "Stay close," Alex whispered, his voice steady, but his gaze never leaving the buildings. "We need to find out who's here." They moved cautiously through the settlement's entrance, the dry, cracked earth crunching beneath their boots. The buildings were small and made of scraps, metal, wood, and whatever else the survivors could find in this harsh desert. Despite the appearance of the settlement, there was something strangely familiar about it. It felt like it had once been something bigger, perhaps even a thriving community, but now it was nothing more than a ghost town. As they walked further into the settlement, a sudden sound broke the silence. Footsteps approaching from behind one of the buildings. Alex quickly spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. But it was only a man, a tall, weathered figure in a torn jacket, holding a rifle in his hand. He didn't look like much of a threat at first glance, but Alex knew better than to judge by appearances. "Who are you?" the man demanded, his voice gruff, but his eyes sharp. Alex and Vaylana both froze, studying the man. His appearance was rugged, his face covered with a scruffy beard, and his eyes were tired, as if he had seen far too many battles. But there was something about him that didn't sit right. He wasn't acting like someone who was just trying to survive. He was too guarded, too alert, as if he was hiding something. "We're just passing through," Alex said cautiously. "We saw the smoke from your settlement. We need help. My friend is. She's not well." The man narrowed his eyes, looking past Alex to Vaylana. She stood a little behind him, her features guarded, as if she was ready to defend herself at any moment. The man's gaze lingered on her, and for a split second, Alex thought he saw recognition flicker in his eyes. "You're not from around here," the man said slowly, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Who are you really?" Alex didn't answer right away, didn't trust this man. There was something off about him. But Vaylana's voice broke through the tension. "We're from another world," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I've been through enough to know when I'm being watched. I won't fight unless I have to." The man's eyes widened slightly at the mention of another world. For a moment, he seemed to consider her words carefully. Then, with a slight nod, he lowered the rifle and stepped aside. "I didn't mean to threaten you," he said, his tone softer now, but still cautious. "I've just seen too many people pass through here pretending to need help, and I've learned not to trust easily." Vaylana stepped forward, her gaze unblinking. "I understand. We've both learned that lesson the hard way." Alex could see the tension easing in the man's posture. He wasn't as much of a threat as he had seemed at first, but Alex wasn't ready to trust him completely. He had learned to be wary, and this man's guarded behavior confirmed his suspicions. The man led them into one of the buildings, a small, makeshift shelter with a few supplies scattered around. Water, dried food, and tools. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The interior was dimly lit, with only a small lantern flickering in the corner. There were more people inside, 2 women and a younger man, all of them looking just as worn out and exhausted as the man who had greeted them. "This is my crew," the man said, introducing the others. "We're the last ones left here. The desert takes everything, sooner or later." Vaylana nodded, her eyes scanning each person carefully, looking for any signs of hostility or hidden agendas. Alex could see that she wasn't convinced, but she was being cautious, which was a good sign. "We didn't come here to stay," Alex said, breaking the silence. "We just need information. We're looking for a way out of this desert, a place where we might find more people, something safer than this wasteland." The man nodded slowly, his expression hardening as if he knew what Alex was talking about. "I know what you mean. There's no safety out here. You think there's a settlement, a place where people are rebuilding. But the truth is, it's all a lie. We were once part of a bigger group, a community, like the one you're looking for." Vaylana tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. What happened? The man let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his dirty hair. We were betrayed, left to die. The people who were supposed to protect us turned on us. Now we're just a handful of survivors, hiding from anyone who might still want us dead. Alex felt a chill run through him at the man's words. It wasn't just the desert that was dangerous, it was the people too. Whoever had betrayed Vailana's people had done the same thing to these survivors. The same ruthless cruelty had played out in this very place. Vailana looked at the man with new understanding. You were part of the same group, the one that destroyed everything, aren't you? The man nodded grimly. We were. We didn't have a choice. They turned on us too, left us behind, just like they left you. Alex exchanged a glance with Vailana. It was becoming clearer now. The people who had betrayed Vailana's kingdom weren't just enemies. They were a threat to everyone who had once been part of their world. And whoever had been behind the destruction was still out there, still pulling the strings, creating chaos, and leaving nothing but devastation in their wake. Alex took a deep breath. So what now? How do we survive this? The man's expression darkened. You can't. No one can. But maybe together, we stand a chance. Just then, one of the women in the group spoke up. There's more to this than you think. The ones who betrayed us are still looking for survivors, especially the ones with knowledge, like your friend. She looked at Vailana as she spoke, her voice soft but intense. They know you're alive. They know you survived. Vailana's face grew pale as the weight of the revelation sank in. It wasn't just about surviving the desert anymore. It was about facing the people who had taken everything from her, and possibly taking everything from Alex as well. For the first time, Vailana allowed herself to show fear. They're coming for me, she whispered, her voice thick with realization. I thought I was free, but I'm not. The man stood up, his expression grim. We all have a choice now. We fight, or we die. But we can't run forever. Alex clenched his fists. It was time to stop running. Time to face the truth of what was coming, no matter the cost. We fight, he said, his voice steady. We fight together. In that moment, everything changed. What had once been a journey to find safety became a fight for survival. But Alex wasn't afraid anymore. With Vailana by his side, and the new survivors who had joined them, they might just stand a chance. The revelation had been clear. They were not just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for everyone who had been left behind, and they were ready to take the first step in that fight. The air was thick with tension as Alex and Vailana stood with the small group of survivors in the makeshift shelter. The reality of the situation was sinking in deeper by the minute. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting to stop a force that had torn apart everything they had once known. The same force that had destroyed Vailana's people, leaving her and the others in a desolate wasteland. Alex could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. The man in the group, who had introduced himself as Luca, had been right. They couldn't run forever. No more hiding. No more waiting. This was the final stand. If they were going to survive, they had to take a stand now, before it was too late. But even as he fought this, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that they might not make it out alive. The small group gathered around the fire in the center of the shelter, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. Luca, the leader of the survivors, spoke first. His voice was low and steady, but there was an edge to it that spoke of the countless battles he had fought. We can't stay here, he said. They know we're here. They know who she is. He nodded toward Vailana, who stood quietly beside Alex, her eyes downcast as she absorbed everything happening around her. They'll come for us soon. And when they do, we have two choices. We can run and hide, or we can fight and try to take them down. We're outnumbered, but we've got the element of surprise. We know the desert better than they do. Vailana, though silent, had been listening intently. She had long since stopped hiding from the truth. The people who had destroyed her home and her family were closing in. And now, they were coming for her. The weight of that knowledge made her feel both helpless and determined. She could no longer sit by and wait for her fate to be decided for her. "I'm not running anymore," she said quietly, her voice firm with resolve. "I've been running my entire life, and look where it's gotten me. I won't let them tear apart what little is left of this world." Luca gave her a brief, approving nod. "That's what I like to hear. We may be small in numbers, but we have something they don't: unity. We're fighting for more than just survival. We're fighting for a future." Alex looked around at the faces of the survivors. Luca, the woman named Mara, and the young man, Jace. They all had a spark in their eyes, a fire that wasn't ready to die. They were ready to fight, just like Vailana. And for the first time since landing on this barren planet, Alex felt a sense of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to push them forward. "We'll need a plan," Alex said, breaking the silence. "We need to know where they're coming from, and how we can hit them where it hurts." Luca nodded, his expression grim. "I've been tracking them for days. They've been moving east, closer to our position. They're well armed, and they've got numbers on their side. But they're not used to desert warfare. They think they can just march in and take us out. We'll use that against them. We know the terrain better than they do," Mara added, her voice steady. "The dunes, the caves. They'll never see us coming." Alex turned to Vailana, his gaze steady. "Are you sure about this? We're talking about going into the heart of their stronghold. There's no turning back once we make our move." Vailana met his gaze, her eyes dark with determination. "I've lost everything. I can't keep hiding. I'm ready." With the decision made, they set to work. The small group of survivors began preparing for the battle ahead. They gathered whatever weapons and supplies they had, reinforcing the shelter and setting up traps around the area. Alex worked closely with Luca and Mara, making sure they had enough water, food, and ammunition to last through the fight. Meanwhile, Vailana found herself deep in thought, her mind racing with memories of her people, her family, and the life she once had. She thought of her mother, of the devastation that had been wrought upon her world. Her hands trembled as she helped prepare the weapons, but her resolve only grew stronger. This fight wasn't just about survival. It was about stopping the people who had destroyed everything she had known. It was about giving the desert something to fight for: a future. The cold wind howled through the barren landscape, whipping sand and ice across the alien desert. In this desolate place, where nothing could survive except the most hardened of creatures, there lay a figure, broken, battered, and abandoned. She was unlike anything a human could imagine. Tall, with skin like polished metal that glinted under the harsh light of two suns. Her glowing eyes were closed, her body bruised and bleeding, her once proud wings now torn and useless at her sides. She was the queen of a mighty alien race, but right now, she was nothing more than a wounded stranger, left to die alone. Her name was Vailana, and she had once been powerful, the leader of her people. Her strength and wisdom had kept her kingdom safe for generations, but everything had changed in a heartbeat. The betrayal had come from the most unexpected place. Her closest allies, the ones she trusted most, turned on her in a brutal act of violence. They had orchestrated her downfall, leaving her for dead on this cold, unforgiving desert planet. Vailana remembered the pain, the explosion that had torn through her ship, the sharp blow to her side that knocked her unconscious. When she awoke, she found herself lying on the frozen ground of an alien world, far from home and in the grip of death itself. Her attackers had made sure she would never escape. They didn't care if she lived or died. They simply left her to face the endless cold of the desert alone. The cold was unbearable. Vailana could feel the icy winds cutting through her body like 1,000 knives. She was dying, and she knew it. The air was thin and harsh, making every breath feel like a struggle. Her strength was fading, her vision blurring. She tried to lift her head, but her neck was stiff, and every movement caused sharp pain to shoot through her. She wanted to scream, but no sound came from her lips. The sand shifted around her, the desolation mocking her helplessness. Despite the agony, she clung to life. Her thoughts were scattered, a fog of confusion clouding her mind. She tried to remember how she had ended up here. She was supposed to be with her people, leading them to peace and prosperity. Instead, she had been betrayed by the very one she had trusted. Her body, once a symbol of power and grace, now felt fragile and weak. She was not the queen anymore, just a broken woman at the mercy of a harsh, unforgiving world. As the night fell, the temperature dropped even further, and Vailana could feel her body growing colder. She fought against the darkness creeping into her mind, struggling to stay awake, but it was becoming impossible. The cold was seeping into her bones, numbing her senses, and the weight of her injuries dragged her into unconsciousness. Suddenly, a sharp noise pierced the silence. The sound of something moving across the desert, a faint echo in the vast emptiness. Vailana's eyes fluttered open, but the world around her was a blur. She could make out a dark shape in the distance, moving toward her. She blinked, her vision clearing slightly, and she saw that it was a figure, a human, strange and out of place in this alien desert. Her heart beat faster, but her body could barely respond. The figure drew closer, and Vailana could see that he was wearing weathered, torn clothing, a scarf wrapped tightly around his face to protect against the cold. He was moving slowly, carefully, as though searching for something or someone. At first, she wondered if he was a mirage, a trick of her dying mind. But then, the human stopped and knelt beside her. Vailana tried to speak, but her voice was nothing more than a rasp, barely audible over the wind. She wanted to ask him who he was, why he was here, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat was too dry, her lips cracked and swollen. Instead, she could only look at him with what little strength she had left. The human seemed to sense her pain. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small bottle of water, unscrewing the cap and carefully bringing it to her lips. She drank greedily, but it was just a small amount, not enough to ease the dryness in her throat. Her hand trembled as she tried to grab hold of the bottle, but her fingers were stiff and weak. "You're lucky I found you," the human said softly, his voice muffled by his scarf. "You shouldn't be out here alone." Vailana wanted to respond, but the words felt too heavy, like they would fall apart before they reached her lips. She tried to look up at him, but her head felt too heavy. She felt so small in this vast, lonely world. She had ruled over millions, but here she was just a broken soul, desperate for help. For the first time in her life, she felt vulnerable, and the thought terrified her.